They are 40, but still rely on their parents, don't even know how to cook an egg or change a light bulb. Okay, you can throw money at things now, but what tells you that this money is going to be there in the future? Well, if you look at France, there is no such accent on material possessions, showing off and, buying designer clothes, buying a nice car. It is a very, very different mentality. I learned what is a credit card only when I came to the UK.
The wealthy, the well-educated, they're not falling for that. It's the ones that don't have it and they want it. You've got people who haven't achieved anything. They're effectively faking it until they make it. How do you kind of distinguish between what is authentic and what is not anymore?
People who are actually successful, they don't feel the need to prove that they're successful. These are the kind of people who would never buy a G-Wagon or some kind of car. This narrative is lots of people who living out of debt, loans, credit card, to prove to their audience that they are successful because they need to attract a certain audience. They're gonna create the illusion that, yeah, look, I've made it. And because I've made it, you can do it too.
Young men are being sold a dream. Get rich fast, become an alpha, get the lifestyle. But behind the filters and the Ferraris is a deeper crisis, one of faith, purpose, and masculinity. Sociologist Dr. William Barylo joins us today to unpack the rise of the alt-bro movement, a toxic hybrid of red pill hustle culture and Islamic branding, and what it reveals about how we as a community talk about money, manhood, and meaning. Dr. William Barylo, welcome. Dr. William Barylo, in a recent video that you did on your YouTube channel, you described how in the mainstream world we've seen the red pill movement, but now there's a halal version of it, which manifests in basically influencers on the internet who are some kind of cross between a dating coach and get-rich-quick scheme gurus. I'd love to hear from you what's going on and where did we go wrong?
I think that my perspective comes from not only being a sociologist, so someone who tries not to say what's good and bad in the society, but what is happening and understand why are people doing certain things or saying certain things, so we can eventually have a conversation around it. And what I see also is as a believer, someone who's concerned because I have people who I know who are either in the family or in my friendship circles who are buying into these narratives, and I can see the very difficult consequences it can have. People having very unhealthy marriages, people having unhealthy parenting, or making really, really bad financial decisions.
Is this the whole movement that's kind of driven by these alt bros that are on the rise on the internet?
So when it comes to the term alt bro itself, it is a term that comes from the 2017 Emmanuel podcast where it first appeared. And then some in this demographic have adopted the label alt bro, but people call them many different things. You have alt voila. I'm referring to an article by Hizermir and Sahar Ghumhor, one of the first academic studies on the matter, but also some people say the Akhirite, the Muslim manosphere, the Muslim red pill, and so on and so on. And it is a very diverse movement. It is very heterogeneous. People don't have aligned on the people are not on the same page in that movement. People sometimes have completely opposing views. And also, when it comes to a lot of educators and others who want to dismiss the movement altogether, I think we need also to be very careful in the sense that it is a movement which has helped some people to some extent, in the sense that, if it has allowed some brothers to go more regularly to the gym or pay attention to their finances or make sure they're ready before committing to marriage. I think that there's some good in there and we can't deny that. But what is worrying is about the overarching narrative that produces lots of harmful consequences on the other end. I like to see them as comrades in struggle, brothers in struggle, people who need our support. But I guess we'll get into that further in the conversation.
And what do you think is the kind of defining characteristic that they have, and what's their worldview that's driving them to basically do what they do?
To make things very, very simple, almost caricatural, but we have to simplify because, again, it's a very diverse movement. I would say it's the rough Muslim equivalent of the Trump supporter. So lots of people who have either anti-black, anti-women narratives saying black Muslims are fitna, Muslim women are creating fitna. What I see on the internet is people considering Islam almost as a giant MMA ring, in the sense that we are at war with lots of different people. We don't exactly know what we stand for, but they have this view of, Muslim women should either be stay-at-home wives or be trophy wives, and Muslim men are some kind of warrior that should defeat all the opponents of Islam in a way.
And where do you think this is coming from? Is it like, I guess it comes from I don't know, this is where I become the amateur sociologist. Is it coming from like a place of helplessness?
There are many factors because it's a very complex issue. But what we've seen is when it has become more vocal, and it coincided with the first Trump mandate. So it was a time where, you remember, there was the rise of lots of social movements, whether it is Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the decolonial movements, which became more and more vocal. And a lot of people have engaged into some kind of reaction to these movements, not even knowing exactly what they were like standing against. Because, for example, when many people say they're against feminism, but like, how do they define feminism? We can get into that a bit later. So a lot of people were reacting to these social movements and felt threatened. For example, white people felt that Black Lives Matter was a threat to them, or lots of men felt that feminism was a threat to them. On top of that, what's characteristic with the alt bros is that they feel that Islam itself is in danger. Islam is on the decline. And why? Because of all these not only social movements, but political narratives, the media, the education system, many different things. So they feel a sense of threat, and they're reacting to that.
Do you think it's fair when I sometimes see the kind of movement that you're talking about on the internet, I almost somehow sometimes feel sorry for them because I feel like they're doing the hustle, that the only hustle they can do in some ways, right? And that's at some level, perhaps it is their fault. Ultimately, they have agency, but at some level they don't. At a kind of macro level, they don't have that many options. And so it's kind of, this is the only path left to them to kind of like try and break free, as it were. Or the alternative is, the chicken shop down the road or becoming an Uber driver. And they're not particularly appetizing alternatives. What do you make of that? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very good point, because if we look at the alt-bro, which seems to be mainly defined against feminism and all this kind of thing, there is also this social dimension which is underlying constantly in the background about how to become an entrepreneur, how to get rich. And one of the studies that have opened my eyes on the matter, aside from talking directly to people, is a study by Mohammed Qasim. So he was a gang member in Bradford back in the days. And then, so he went to prison, got his PhD, and decided to go back to Bradford and do a research project on like his friends and acquaintances in the gangs. And he was observing that these people feel in a state of siege. They don't see a way out. And this is a reality that I have observed as well, talking to many people. They don't feel there's any way out. So why the alt-bro narrative is so tempting and appealing, it is because it is empowering. People who didn't have an agency are able to imagine themselves as having power or finally control over their lives.
And what do you think differentiates them, with legitimate influences, right? So there's like this spectrum almost, right? Where you've got people who, forget the Islamic space for a second, because there's always equivalents in the mainstream space as well, right? Where you've got people who are very successful entrepreneurs and they've got YouTube channels and they're kind of doing their thing, fine. And then you've got people who haven't achieved anything, and they're effectively faking it until they make it. And then you've got this kind of spectrum in the middle. Where do you think how do you kind of distinguish between what is authentic and what is not anymore?
There's many questions in that one, but usually, by experience, people who are actually successful, they don't feel the need to prove that they're successful. They I just take example of any people who I know who are actually really rich. These are the kind of people who would never buy like a G-Wagon or some kind of car. They're driving an Audi A3 from 2004. I think lots of what goes into this narrative is lots of people who may be living, out of debt, loans, credit card, to prove to their audience or even to everyone around this that they are successful, and this in material terms. And because they need to attract a certain audience or they need to attract a certain opinions, they're gonna invest into this lifestyle, as to say, to create the illusion that, yeah, look, I've made it, and because I've made it, you can do it too.
And where do you think like this comes from as a, our relationship or our understanding of wealth, as a community? That sounds to me pretty toxic. That sounds to me like, we've stumbled somewhere.
A lot of it comes from this narrative, which has been popularized in the 1980s, called neoliberalism, which is having prevalent in the UK and the US. Because, for example, if you look at France, if you go to France, there is no such accent on material possessions, showing off and buying designer clothes, buying a nice car. It is a very, very different mentality. I learned what is a credit card only when I came to the UK 12 years ago. So the narrative of neoliberalism was that it's a culture of competition, individualism, every man for themselves, and it has created myths such as the self-made man, the illusion that whatever is your social economic condition, you can transcend all the barriers of society. You can transcend poverty, you can transcend racism if you get rich. And to get rich, you need to work hard enough. But of course, this is something that is completely distant from the reality. But people buy it because it is very appealing. It is, again, people are disempowered. They're looking for motivation. They're looking for ways out. So this is very attractive. And the second thing is the ease which is given to people. So we have an extremely easy access to bank loans, credit cards. People can get like heavily in debt to create this kind of lifestyle and thinking that there will be no consequences whatsoever.
I'm interested to kind of hear that your experience in France was actually very different to the experience here. Is it that the neoliberalism hasn't seeped into France as vividly as it has in the UK? Is that the experience, or what's causing that?
I would say, as a rule of thumb, France is 5 years behind the UK, so they always end up catching up. The thing is, however, is first, the class system is very different because, of course, you've got a class system, but it's not like you have lords and barons and baronesses in France, and it doesn't, being of aristocratic descent doesn't grant you any privilege. And the education system is very, very cheap, meaning that you can pay, it's around 300, 400 euros. So yeah, 300 pounds a year for your university studies. And people usually, I would say, differentiate themselves based on culture and education more than wealth or material possessions. So it might be completely irrelevant for you to have the latest luxury sedan in France, but it would matter more in terms of career progression or job opportunities if you're familiar with the text of Molière, for example.
Very interesting. And I think that's just, I guess, what the culture and the society has put value on, right? That's ultimately what's driving that.
Yes, French elitism puts a heavy emphasis on culture. And I would say France puts a huge emphasis on culture more than anything else. So when you look at the French elite, what differentiates them from the rest is the education they had. And there's you have private schools, but they don't play the same role as in the UK. So most people have access to similar levels of education and quality of education.
But then, Dr. William, I might say, actually, hang on. If you look at the UK elite as well, the really true elite, as you said yourself, right? They don't necessarily have bling bling and fast cars and watches, and I almost think of that as like the I don't know, the nouveau riche, or the kind of the petit bourgeois. It's that kind of crowd that wear the trappings of luxury. I think that arguably that's the same in the UK, where actually the true elite, perhaps they don't really care about that.
I would say yes. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, when we look at the elite, because again, they have nothing to prove, nothing to aspire to. They're already comfortable. So of course, yeah, it makes sense.
How should we, as a Muslim community, of course, you've got the influencer who's set his flag in the ground, and he's saying, or she is saying that I've smashed it because I'm selling these courses, and training you up on, I don't know, like a something, an Airbnb business or I don't know, some kind of business. And then you've got the person who is watching that. From an Islamic framework, what's the guidance to the person doing it and the person watching it?
I think this is a very relevant point because, as in many things, you have the figureheads of the movement that always have something to sell, an online course, as you mentioned, and you have the followers and who have a very different mindset. Because in that space, which is, by the way, nothing really new, we saw it in the early 2000s. About dating culture, if you're familiar with like the game theory and this kind of things. So I remember when I was a teenager, it was really, really popular, and we were browsing internet forums about game theory, how to get girlfriends and stuff, because it was exciting. And what we have witnessed is just a recycling of this very same grift, in the sense that, yeah, I've made it, I can show you how to do it. But what people have to sell is not true advice. It's just, selling an online course for people who have to sell an online course. It's like almost a pyramid scheme in a way. When it comes to the figureheads, it's a reflection not only of greed and selfishness, but you have people who are genuinely trapped into these kind of things. Because when we talk about the alt bros, there's, of course, those who have these online courses to sell, but you have people who just are using YouTube and social media to pay the bills. And this is something very different, because the problem is, I'm thinking about some people in particular that are very, really clever. And, this is something they never wanted to do. But are they doing it? It's because this is what brings engagement rates up. This is what brings an audience in. And when you treat social media as a business, that's the main problem. You are trapped either by your sponsorships or by what your audience wants. So let's say you really like history. You want to make a long form content about history. Like, who's going to watch this? So, yeah. This is why, people are more attracted to, debates, intellectual boxing matches and this kind of things. And of course, whatever people say about, getting rich quick, this is going to sell. One thing I was thinking about the followers is we sadly live in a society where people, like all of us, were not taught critical thinking. It is very, very hard for us to differentiate what is sound advice and what is not. Because when it comes to whether it is financial literacy or relationships, marriage, where should we find the knowledge? Like my parents never taught me that. I never learned this at school, either at uni, in the workplace, and now, even at the mosque, like where are people supposed to go to get this kind of knowledge? And now we have the internet, but again, what tells you that what someone is saying on the internet is sound advice or not? Maybe he's just trying to sell you something.
And I think this is the challenge that we have right now, isn't it? Where the internet and social media and the algorithms, they have created almost an egalitarian, like there's a democracy, right? In terms of, if you can make certain algorithms or certain key metrics move, then it's better for the channel. It's better for the channel or the account, and it's better for the YouTube or for Google, whoever it is that owns that channel, because they make money through ads or they make money through engagement, and that creates an egalitarianism in a weird way, because the barrier to entry is no longer you need to have actually done something. The barrier to entry is, can you make this algorithm work in your favor? And I think the danger with that is, you kind of end up with the substance of it, the richness, the viscosity, like the deepness of what we're actually covering just seems to be thinning out. And it's almost like you're getting these sharp adrenaline hits with the hook at the start, the hook at the end, and it's where I don't know where more we can actually even go anymore.
Yeah. So you say, I think I would like to rephrase what you said, because maybe the algorithms are egalitarian in the sense that anyone can play the game of the attention economy. But my contention is, who are the people playing the game and what happens? What are the consequences of it? And the problem is, because there is still a human dimension in the social media game. What I have seen happening, whether we're talking about the algo or the general influencer scene, is some kind of digital Darwinism, in the sense that it is the survival of the most controversial, and although those who have the biggest numbers. And now you probably know that we can buy these numbers. We can buy, followers, subscribers, can even buy custom comments to create this illusion. And it is very likely that lots of people in the game have been getting real life deals and money out of hot air. And this is the problem when people put the emphasis on this culture of numbers and the appearances, fake it until you make it. And it is unfair for the people who do not have the resources to buy these engagement rates, or who do not want to engage into things they don't feel is morally acceptable, just like, putting out there anything that is controversial, anything that's going to catch a reaction for the sake of a reaction, just because they know it's going to attract an audience.
And it makes me reflect on the story of Qarun, Qarun, where he, in the time of Moses and the Bani Israel, and Qarun was this guy, right, who had everything given to him, huge amounts of wealth, and it was quite in a weird way. The Quran is actually kind of describing this movement, really, right? Where, it's very ostentatious wealth. You've got this huge ring that multiple people have to carry to actually open the keys to his treasures. I mean, why do you need that, right? There's no need to have like a massive ring this big, this key this big. And he does that, and the people see him, like he's not hiding this away. He's kind of ostentatiously showing this off, and people want to be like him, right? He's creating this desire. And the Quran describes how there's some people who, a little bit more switched on, and they say, don't wish to be like that. Care about the thing that's really everlasting, care about the hereafter. And then, of course, ultimately what ends with destruction, where Qarun, basically loses everything. And the people who were seeing him then saying, I wish I was like him the day before, they've completely changed their tune, and they're, okay, thank God we weren't like him. I wonder, what are your reflections on this story?
Well, I think it's a very, very powerful story, which is too many times overlooked for some reason. And what I found really fascinating is the analogy with the weight of his wealth, because weight is a burden. And when you look, people who seem at the top, because I've interviewed like influencers who have like in the millions, they're not happy. It is a true burden, fame and this kind of success, or even like worse, the illusion of pretending having wealth is a huge burden on like everything, your mental health, your bodily health, your finances, your family life, everything. And when we look at the Outbros, what I found really sad is, this is a space that argues that we need brotherhood, which is true. We need brotherhood. It's super important. But when you look at how they behave online, people having beef with each other, people bullying each other, people stealing ideas from each other in that space. So I just wonder, how is it going to be sustainable in the long term? I don't see any way out. And it is sadly, as much as they use religious, Islamic lexicon, vocabulary, this is a space which I find very sadly away from the prophetic's teaching, because it's almost as if we are under threat, we have been disempowered, so now let's create our own form of supremacy. It's like, if you're Muslim, but if you don't tick their right boxes, you're not a valid Muslim. You are an intellectual apostate, as they say. And to me, what it reminds me as a sociologist, this divide and conquer strategy is the same thing that has been used during the British Empire. It is the same thing that has been used against Muslims during the War on Terror, Prevent and such. And it is the very same strategies used by colonial Zionist propaganda. So can we just look at 1 second at the paradox? We have a bunch of Muslims who are using the tools, the intellectual tools of the Zionists and colonial agents. And this is crazy to me, because instead of engaging with the actual powers that threaten Muslims, whether it is governments, whether it is lobbies, whether it is multinationals, they just punch down.
Dr. William, what do you think about, you touched about the fact that they talk about Islam within what they are covering. They would say, well, actually, that's because that is part of our way of life, and we're taking that guidance and we're sharing it with the masses. What's your kind of perspective on that as a response?
I think the Islamic concepts they are using or some would say cherry picking, are very much informed by a modern Western lens. For example, the whole dismissal of things like feminism and critical race theory, their main argument is because these are Western ideologies. But then these are people who would at the same time use analogies of, the alpha and beta male, the red pill, the matrix. What are they? They are Western modern ideologies as well. So it doesn't really make sense.
I guess, there are bits of Islam that are not being covered as well, right?
Yes. To add on that, when it comes to those who sell the more materialistic mindset, I think also it is sad to see that Dubai has replaced Mecca. Instead of aspiring to do Hajj one day, now you have the obligatory yearly pilgrimage to Dubai in a way. It's hard for me to make sense of it. I can understand, the why and the how, the appeal of Dubai and stuff. As you mentioned, their interpretation of Islam was it's very selective in the sense that, for example, they would peddle this narrative that the Muslim man should be the sole breadwinner of the family, while completely ignoring that Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was what they call a career woman. She had her own business that she inherited from her dad. And when the Prophet married her, he was poor. And she eventually became his boss. So that's kind of crazy. We know facts such as the Prophet was to fix his own clothes. And I think the kind of manhood that the Albros are selling is more of a delayed adolescence. What is this dream of, making six figures, becoming an entrepreneur, buying a Lambo, and flying off to Dubai?
Multiple wives.
Yeah, multiple wives, exactly. Well, if I reflect on my own life, what made me become an adult? And let's put aside, marriage or parenthood for 1 second. Even before that, it was the toughest experiences in my own life. It was, first embracing Islam, and my parents were really, really upset about it. But it took a lot of strength for me to try to mend this relationship with my parents, and this is one of the things I'm the most proud of. It is migrating to a country where I didn't know anyone, with literally, I was minus when I came to the UK, and yes, starting from scratch. It was becoming homeless and squatting in a house for 2 years before I was able to recover from that. It was, having difficult relationships with my friends, but eventually mending these relationships. And now, I always think Allah can take my wealth from me. Allah can take my family away from me. But what nobody can take from me is my skills, my character, all the strength that I've developed during all these years. So if I had, God forbid, have to start again from scratch, let's say something, it's the end of the world, whatever, I know how to do it. I can do it, inshallah. But, and what they are selling is, jet skiing in Dubai and, solving problems by just throwing money at it. But what if you don't have money anymore? What if, and one of the paradoxes is a lot of people who buy into these narratives, they are 40, but still rely on their parents. I know so many people who are in their 40s and don't even know how to cook an egg or change a light bulb. How do you live? Okay, you can throw money at things now, but what tells you that this money is going to be there in the future? There's no long-term thinking.
The people that they're selling to, I find that they're often the most vulnerable as well in society, because the wealthy, the well-educated, they're not falling for that. It's the ones that don't have it and they want it.
Exactly, yeah. Because in my fieldwork, when I think about the men who are attracted to these like a red pill / manosphere narrative, who are they? It's people who are really struggling to find a relationship, to get married. It's people who have been wronged by women and have entered this kind of revenge mode. These are people who yield under the pressure of their peers at high school, at uni. And it's people who are generally in a very difficult financial situation as well. Let me tell you a story. So once I attended the now defunct Muslim Entrepreneur Network, one of the events, because I'm also a freelance videographer. So they wanted me to film one of their events. And the irony, they paid me on time, very promptly, and they didn't even negotiate my fees. Never seen that. But I thought, to myself, it would be a good opportunity to see who attends these events. And when I was chatting to the people in the audience, and you could see there's like literally a bit of everyone, but it's mostly, single parents, uncles who are really, really struggling, or young men who are, like have been brought up in council estate and stuff. And it's people who are so desperate for one atom of hope of making it in life, or just, changing their situation, that they would give 2,000, 3,000 pounds, or sometimes their whole life savings to people they barely know. Just because you have this veneer of religiosity, oh, alhamdulillah, mashallah, inshallah, you'll make it. And just, people fall for it because they're so desperate. When you're in survival mode, it's very, very difficult to think critically. Like, am I okay to just trust this person? And you see what happened. It was all over the news. The leaders were arrested. And I don't even know if people have recovered their money.
No, I'm not sure. I don't think many have. Dr. William, what about the solutions to all this? Like, part of me sits here thinking that, a lot of this stuff is happening as a reaction to real problems. There are actually real problems here that, those guys who are struggling to get married, or who are struggling to get a job, or who, are trying hard to kind of be Muslim in this hyper-sexualized environment or hyper kind of capitalist environment. And they're trying to navigate this path, and they don't find any tribe that they can be part of. I feel like that's a real problem, which the alt bros, I guess, are looking to try and solve in their own way. But what is a real solution to this?
Yeah, before I touch upon the solutions, I just wanted to fit an anecdote, which I think is very, very revealing. So I know someone who saved for, let's say, 20, 30 years, and with all the cash, instead of investing in a house or a proper place to live in, they bought a Mercedes G63 AMG cash from the dealership. So I think it's something over £200,000 instead of investing in somewhere. And so even if you don't know much about cars, you never buy a car new from the dealership. You'd at least wait a few years so it depreciates it, because it's very steep. But yeah, it very saddens me that people are not able to think critically about this. So talking about solutions.
Why did you do that?
Huh?
Why did you do that?
I have no clue. I don't think they know themselves. Lots of people do these kind of financial decisions, and I just sometimes struggle. I think to me it cries either desperation or being fed up with something. And as we've talked about, we need to think about, when it comes to especially Muslims in the UK, that I'm generalizing, I know, but it is a people who have been bearing the trauma of generations, centuries of oppression. We can talk about colonization. For some people, it was the Atlantic slave trade. Then you had the trauma of partition, the trauma of migration, moving to a country where they didn't know anyone and they had to face racism and Islamophobia. And, when you go through all these steps and you're in survival mode for so many generations, so people don't have even the tools to transmit to their kids, how to make better financial decisions, how to, be better parents. This is something I've experienced with my own parents, who are Polish migrants who moved to France. I grew up with them, slamming doors and shouting, and they never taught me what it is to be a good husband, what is a healthy marriage. And I didn't know better. And people are not taught all these kind of, not given the tools by the society. And I'm referring again to the study of Mohammed Qasim. Even in the community, you have people, all the uncles, they tell the young kids, don't go near alcohol, don't consume it, don't sell it, don't do anything. But the same uncles would sell alcohol in the corner shops. So not only, the society, the mainstream society doesn't give people the tools to get out of these conditions, because, they are not given job opportunities, career progression opportunities. But at the same time, the communities that are so broken by all this like chain reaction of oppression that people are trapped. And on the top of it, and this is one key difference with France, is we live in a society that atomized communities, atomized families. People are buying this, sold this a narrative that, we need to make it on our own But if we look at the story of every successful business, every successful venture, even if we look, successful filmmakers, artists, there is never such a thing as the self-made man or self-made woman. It's always, a group, a team that works together. But even the society has atomized people to the extent that even in the mosque, we don't find the brotherhood. That is one of the key, let's say, social pillars of the Islamic tradition. And because it has atomized, so we need to think, first of all, where is it possible for us to recreate these links between people, not only with people who are our age or share similar experiences, but also the elders or people who are younger. It's super important to have multi-generational dynamics. But it's just very hard in a city like London, where everything is far from each other. And you look at France, cities are much smaller, transportation is much cheaper. There's, just a simple fact. If I want to see a friend who is in London, so I live in Surrey, I don't only need to do 1.5 hour journey to reach them, whether it is by car or by train is very similar. But, if I want to pay for my train ticket, that's what, £30 away and back. That's more than a full meal for someone. So it's very, very difficult for people just, in this context to be able to see each other. And I believe this is the first step which is necessary. And we need to find alternative ways of doing it. So you have initiatives that try to offer solutions. I'm thinking about the OGs, the footwear retreats in Liverpool by Sheikh Ibrahim or CFA. This is one guy who's tried to do that. In the Midlands, you have an initiative called Mansheds by Razwan Faraz. It's retreats, very similarly, a bunch of men of all faith unknown who just come together and, talk about stuff. And on my end, again, it's completely experimental, but there is a lovely hub in London called Rumi's Cave. And this Ramadan, we've started an outdoor activity club for young men. And the concept is very simple. We just get together, do stuff, learn new skills, whether it is, hiking, trekking, camping, bushcrafting, kayaking, whatever. And let's see how it goes. Because I think this is the very first step. If we don't have strong bonds between people, we can't do anything, because this is actually the ultimate goal of divide and conquer. Reduce people to individuals and make them feel that they're on their own and there's no way out. You have to play the game of the system. Well, no, if we come together, we can find alternatives. The parents' generation, they had something wonderful called committee. Like, where is it gone now? Like, who among people our age still do committee? And this is something that has been able to bypass the banking system. People have bought houses with that. People have funded their studies with that, opened business with that. That's wonderful, without paying one dime for interest.
I want to go back to your friend who bought the 200,000 Mercedes, because I found that fascinating. And do you think it was wrong for him to do that?
I don't like to think in terms of right and wrong, but putting this amount of cash in a car, so a depreciative asset, is going to prevent him from putting this money elsewhere where this money could have grown. Or, I don't know, it could have benefited him in many other ways, because this is literally, for a big part of this chunk of money going to the trash. Unless he bought maybe like a super rare collector item kind of vehicle, maybe, but still largely, your random average G63 MG, even though it's a prestigious car, the value drops like extremely quickly.
And what does he work as?
He works in like software development, something like that.
Right. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, because people do this all the time, right? They buy expensive, like in Whitechapel, you'll see very nice cars all the time, some of them on lease, which is also, I guess, a waste of money. Where I guess I'm trying to get to is, because these people would say that, look, let's assume they can't afford it, right? If they can afford it, fine. They might say that I too deserve a chance. I too deserve to taste some of the finer things in life. And when's my turn? I don't know. What do you have to say to that?
This is really tough, because I can understand the emotional impact it can bring, to buy something new, because maybe you grew up and you could never have dreamt of owning a nice car, owning nice clothes. The reality is, it is something, in the brain. We have this organ called the amygdala, which is the siege of the flight or fight response. And this is an organ that can, explain lots of the awful things we see in the mainstream. Why do people, for example, are really tempted by narratives like nationalism or this kind of things? And this is something very similar in the sense that it is something that produces a very strong emotional response that is, to be honest, very hard to control. And this is why, alhamdulillah, as humans, we have something called the frontal cortex, which its job is to make us critical of all these guts feeling. And, if I'm doing this, if I'm trusting this person, is it actually right or wrong? But I'm not going to dive deeper into it. And the thing is, there's a lot of frustrations I see that go into these kind of purchases, which only, it's a coping mechanism. People just do this to feel good. But sadly, the thing is, they would feel good for a short amount of time, but then later down the line, they will face consequences, which means financial difficulties, or it's going to hit them back in the face. And I think, the first step for that is for people to try to not bypass these instincts, because, it's about acknowledging that they exist. We want nice things. We, as humans, we like stability, we like comfort, we don't like to struggle. But thinking very critically about, could there be a better way of, let's say, investing this money, an alternative, something different that, I can just hold on for a few more months or a few more years and enjoy even more later down the line. But, it is a very difficult battle, because when we talk about, our guts feeling, they are very, very intense. It doesn't respond to logic, or it's not rational. We cannot discuss, these kind of things. But what we can learn how to do is try to tame our emotions and try to think long term. Because one of the most powerful tools of neoliberal narratives, it makes us believe that there is no future, there's no alternative. It makes us literally feel pessimistic. And when you hear, all these narratives from the Albros that, Islam is in the decline, we are threatened, it's a very pessimistic narrative where people need hope. They need to see that another future, a different future is possible, and you don't have to play the game of the system.
Dr. William, what about this optimistic future? What is your message to someone listening to this who's kind of trying to, find his way or her way to this optimistic future?
I don't have, a pre-made advice, because everyone's circumstances are different. Everyone may need a different answer depending on their circumstances. But, this very question is something that I have asked myself for many other reasons. Being someone who doesn't tick the right boxes in this country, for example, is one of them. And seeing how the system traps us made me always wonder, how can we escape that? And actually, this is why I've written this book, which is the result of more than 15 years of research. Because not only I wanted to draw a diagnosis of the society, what's harming people, what's wrong with what surrounds us, and how the society literally colonizes our mind, colonizes our beings. And I wanted to have a look at all the people, because you've got a few alternatives, you've got initiatives that tell us that doing things differently are possible. So I've looked at many different alternatives, whether it is in the field of arts, community organizing, culture and heritage, protection of the environment, mental health, and many, many more. And you will see that the common thread of these people is, there's not people who are super famous, super rich. They're not super connected. They don't have huge networks. It's all, a bunch of friends. They started because, let's say, they care about the environment. They wanted to do something original about it. And it just started, two sisters, then, people in their family, and then friends of friends. And yes, it takes really a long time, because these are organizations that have been growing up for, 10, 15 years, sometimes single-handedly, just one person driving them. But when I see the fruits of what they have produced, it's just wonderful. You couldn't imagine 10 years ago that they would, gather so many people. And they tell us that, you may don't have the money, the fame, or the power, the connections now, but what you have is, you have your intentions, you have a certain set of skills, aspirations, and there's always, people around us that, are ready to support us, ready to hear what we have to say, and ready to help us, even if themselves, they're kind of struggling. Of course, it's not, a flashy, Instagrammable solution, because it takes a really long time, a lot of effort, a lot of work, but it's possible. it's a fight against the system, literally. But I think from what I've seen, it's worth it, because it might not make you a millionaire, but something we overlook very much is it makes our little surroundings much better in many other ways, spiritually, mentally, physically. And I think that's what matters the most.
And what about the cultural and the kind of, I guess, ethnic or class element to all of this as well, right? Because like it or not, I know for myself, I would say I'm pretty middle class. If I'm honest with myself, I'm not sure about your background, but I would probably hazard the same guess. And I think, for me to come up with a solution, it's going to be different to, deep in the heart of East Ham, Romford Road, or, in the behind Whitechapel, the East London Mosque, that kind of area. The reality is I've never lived that experience. And it comes with all of its upbringing, but also the cultural and social trappings and the discourse. And it's actually probably often the narrative of the alt bros, right? That's a lot of what's being talked about. And I think, the solution kind of needs to be, I guess, authentic to where it comes from, right? And I don't know, can you help us perhaps see how there could be an alternative to the alt bros and how it could come about and what people need to do to make that happen?
I don't think there's a silver bullet kind of solution for that, because again, it's a very complex problem, and they have so many different narratives intertwined in them. But largely what you're saying, and this is, I agree with you, it's how do we talk and reach to people who are still in survival mode? Because although my parents came from Poland with nothing, and now if I look at me saying oh my God, I've become middle class. But yeah, not everyone is able to escape this condition very easily, and some people never achieve it. And it's very hard, because there's a lot of structures in the society that have a role to play. And this is why sometimes I wish we were living in some kind of smaller village where if the parents are not there for the kids, maybe it can be the mosque, maybe it can be the school, maybe it can be some other institution. Now this is the main problem of the modern society, how it's atomized people. It has literally cut off the links between all these different structures in the society, and people are just left to struggle on their own, or just grabbing some bits from the internet. So rather than talking about solutions, I'd rather talk about what can we do even if we are not directly connected to these spaces anymore. What can we do in our small circle? So one thing which is very, very strong with human society, and I think is really beautiful, is that the concept of osmosis, which means basically leading by the example. If you are able to just sort yourself out, build a healthy marriage, build a healthy family, and you never know how this is going to be spreading around you to your extended circles, with your friends. If you cultivate beautiful friendships, your kids might interact with their kids, who may interact with other kids. It's a long-term game. If we can't see fixes right now, we need to remember that, there is a future, and everything becomes possible then.
No, Jazakallah khair, Dr. William. That's really powerful words to end us on. I think we can all think about families or communities or little pockets that we've come across in our travels around the world, even in this country, where we think, wow, that's, I want to be part of that. And perhaps all we need to do is create that magnetic pull in our local area and our families, and become better ourselves. And that then kind of, creates the ecosystem around it. Dr. William, on the solutions part, a big important part of this is the economic aspects, right? And people don't have enough money. And a part of that is part of the wider economic structure. And, we don't necessarily need to go into all of that. But because of that, it creates this yearning, right? And a vulnerability to where to look and what to do. And the reality is, to become an entrepreneur and do it well, I think is a fantastic thing. It's actually a very liberating thing, but it's not easy. And perhaps that's where the disconnect is. It's not as easy as people think. My one question is, how should people approach finding advice on entrepreneurship and approaching that? And then the second part is, not everyone's going to be an entrepreneur, and we shouldn't fetishize this thing either. It's only going to be a small handful of people who even want to do it. It's not necessarily the pinnacle of life to be an entrepreneur. And for everyone else, where should they be looking when it comes to investments? And how are they going? Should be they navigating their payment flows through their life in a way that allows them to make better decisions than perhaps putting £200,000 or their life savings into a car. What are your thoughts?
There's a lot of information available on the internet, and there is a lot of sound advice available on the internet. But again, my question is, how can people make the difference between what's sound advice and what's not? And I think this is very difficult because, for example, the channels which I follow in terms of financial advice, which are I think the most sound, are not the most flashy. It's actually very boring, if you like. But one thing that also helps, I think, is very important, is to talk to people who are entrepreneurs in real life, who own businesses and can, have this hands-on experience. Because the problem is on the internet, not only, there's lots of all sorts of advice, but there's, as you mentioned, there's a reality that is very often occluded, is because, having myself set up 2 businesses, it is really hard. It's not even guaranteed to work. And I know people who are in businesses as well, and sometimes they struggle for years and years and years before eventually being profitable. It's really, really tough. And it's a lot of trial and error. You try 10 times, and maybe out of these 10 times, there's only once it's going to work. There's a lot of trial and error, a lot of failure, and sometimes with disastrous consequences. And people need to be ready for that, knowing that, you don't invest more than what you are willing to lose. I think we shouldn't, it's not repeated enough. And only, people who have the experience are able to tell, oh, this is what I did wrong. This is what I could have been better, because this kind of advice is rarely really found on the internet. And I think it is important for people to be able to assess the reality. And if they see something which looks too good to be true, they always need to dig deeper. Like, is there something else that I haven't thought about or they're not telling me? Because again, the problem with social media, when people treat it as a business, of course, they're going to sugarcoat it because they want to appeal people. So they're going to use this empowerment narrative that, if I was able to make it, you can make it too. But that's just for drawing crowds in. And this is, okay, I understand, but, let's be careful about whenever someone has something to sell, because sadly, people are going to tweak, the discourse. And I think, in my opinion, nothing replaces real life experience or the advice of people who have real life experience.
It's been a pleasure having you. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you.